I read The Notebook. I read all kinds of different ones that you probably wouldn't see a man reading. And in college, oftentimes, the women that I knew would come to my dorm room to get the newest Nicholas Sparks novel because they knew that I'd had it. And so love stories really have played a big part in my life. And I'd say out of any book in the Bible that I've read the most, it's been Ruth all the way through. I've probably read it over 20 times all the way through because I love it. And I love what God does, not only for Ruth, but for Naomi and Boaz. But before we get into this, let's go ahead and say a prayer. Dear God, we just want to thank you so much for this church, God. We want to thank you for the people. God, I pray that today that they are reminded that regardless of whether or not you're mentioned very much in this book, you are very much a part of what goes on in this situation, God. Not only for Elimelech, but also for Ruth and Naomi as they go through some stuff that isn't so easy. And God, it's amazing to see how even through Sunday school and even through our worship director, there's been statements that said that, you know, life isn't easy, but God, sometimes we have to grab onto you. God, and that's exactly what Ruth and Naomi have to do, God. And so today, we're going to walk through your word, and God, I ask that people open their ears to hear, and God, that it makes an impact, and God, that you use me to deliver. And God, it's in your name. Amen. All right, so today's sermon is called Faith in Action. So as an opener, an introduction, on March 4th, 1950, Walt Disney Production produced an animated musical fantasy film. Can anyone guess which one this was? So, wait, good try. Well, so if many of you didn't know, some of you do know because I went to high school with you all. One of the things that I did in high school was I was in the drama club. I loved acting. I loved being a part of productions. And the largest role that I ever played in high school was the king in Cinderella. I was the cool guy that got to wear underwear on stage. It was awesome. So, to be honest with you, musical theater has kind of taken a big part of my life. I love to sing, I love to act, and I love to be a part of those. So yes, today what we're going to be talking about in conjunction with Ruth is Cinderella. Cinderella was a film based on Charles Perrault's 1697 fairy tale of the same title and was Disney's 12th featured film, which followed Bambi in 1942 and then Snow White in 1937. That was a good shot. Good try. It consisted of a group of amazing characters that you either loved or you hated. We find the main protagonist, Cinderella, and her trusty group of helpers, the mice by the name of Bert, Mert, Luke, Mary, Susie, and Perla. And then they had a horse named Major, and there was a dog that you couldn't forget named Bruno. Also a part of that character of good characters was the king, the Grand Duke, the fairy godmother, and Prince Charming. Now, in the group of characters that we didn't really like so well, but have made kind of a footprint on all of Disney, was the wicked stepmother, Lady Tremaine, her daughters, Anastasia and Gisela, and if you didn't know the cat's name, it's Lucifer. So that's pretty interesting right there. So as we make our way through the beginning of Ruth, I would like to show how these two stories compare, because I think that they are very similar despite having some differences. And if you're like my wife and you're wondering, how in the world did Garrett come up with Cinderella and Ruth? Well, I have a daughter. And this week, my daughter, when I was trying to get her to sleep, and she said, "Daddy, I want that princess." And I was like, "Really? The 1950s princess? Okay." And so I turned on Cinderella, and all of a sudden I had this epiphany that, man, that looks a lot like Ruth's story there. It's a little bit different, but in the same way, it's kind of similar. But Ruth's story is a story that has a big message, but is in a very short amount of scripture in the Bible. It shows how God is constructing his grand story out of small, seemingly inconsequential stories of everyday people. He's working in them. And as I'll allude when I get to script verse number 1, the story is interwoven with the timeline of the judges. But ultimately the story is, wow, I messed that note up. But it's a story that concerns all of mankind, right? Not just the judges, not just Ruth, but everyone. Just like in our own story, Ruth shows that God is at work in day-to-day activities of average people. All of the characters in this story have challenges. They have death. They move. They have financial resources. They have familiar responsibilities. They have food scarcity. And regardless of that, they find God is weaving a story out of redemption in all of those details. As always, there's a theme verse, just like there was when we talked about the woman in the well and in John. And the theme verse in Ruth can be found in chapter 1, verse 16. It says, Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you. Wherever you will go, I will go, and wherever you will lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." I'm sure some of you have heard that before. Oftentimes, at least whenever I like to prepare for weddings, that is one of the scriptures that many people will ask for. So Ruth serves as a great reminder that we should always see God in our day-to-day lives, and that we are part of God's bigger plans, not only to change ourselves, but to change the world. So let's go ahead and hop into the story of Ruth. So if you will, open your Bibles up to Ruth chapter 1. I'm sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied all day. All right, so let's go ahead and read that. So now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, and they are Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. They went to the country of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. She was left and her 2 sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. And they dwelt there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so the women survived their 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with Ruth and her daughter-in-law, that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Therefore she went out from that place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each to your mother's house. The Lord deal with you kindly as you have dealt with me and the dead. The Lord grant you and may find rest, each in his house of her husband." So she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "Surely we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb, that they may have to be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should say I have a husband tonight and should always bear sons, would you wait for them till they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So that was verses 1 through 14. So today, just like every sermon that you've heard from me in the past, there is a main point of today's sermon. And that main point is that we all have decisions to make, and sometimes those decisions lead to disaster. And sometimes all we have is our faith to lean on, so it must be put into action. So that leads me to point number 1, which is a decision to make. A decision to make. And so verse 1 is full of all kinds of rich information that we must make known before we go into the story of Ruth. At the beginning of verse 1, we learn that the time in which the story takes place. It takes place in the days when judges ruled. That refers to the book of Judges, where 400 plus years there was a period of anarchy. And what anarchy is a society without a government. It was a period of oppression. And honestly, it was a period in which the Israelites do not like to talk about. The Jews do not like to refer back to this period, because it was a period that wasn't ruled by kings, but it was a time where judges were raised up by God and sent in order to perform for the Israelites to do what they needed to do to bring them back to God. These judges were Othniel, they were Ehud, Shamar, I'm horrible with names, Deborah, Gideon, Tola, Jair, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, and Samson. And so if you didn't know this, that's where we got my son's name, Gideon. It was from Gideon in the Bible. It says in Judges 2:16 that nevertheless the Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the hand of the one who plundered them. So it was the judges who were sent to deliver these people out of those hands of people who would come in and hurt them or wipe them out or do harm to them. So we see that the Hebrew word for judges in the Old Testament was shaphat. It had a much wider meaning than just administering justice or to pass sentence. It also meant to rule or to command. It was the judge's job as God's chosen leaders to deliver Israel back to God. Their job was to not rule as kings, but to lead Israel during this challenging time. But just like anybody else that has ruled or any other part of human society, there was this constant cycle, as we saw when judges died. We saw Israel would rebel. Then we would see God would discipline them in some form or fashion. Sometimes it would be through God sending people in to take over Israel or things to happen in Israel. And then Israel would repent because of what God just put them through. And then, of course, God would then send a judge to deliver them back. And so there would be a little bit of harmony for a little bit until a judge died. And then Israel's cycle started all over again. So as you can imagine, this was a trying time not only for the Israelites, but for the judges of which God had put into place. But we see that during this time, and on top of what was going on in the book of Judges, that we see there was a certain man named Elimelech and his family, Naomi, Mahlon, and Chilion, experiencing hard times as well, because there was a famine in the land. And so, you know, as a dad, one of the things that I hear about quite often with my wife is when it's time to go grocery shopping, right? My wife the other day, she said, Garrett, we've got to go to Sam's Club. We've got to get some food. And so just like for Elimelech and his wife, he was concerned that his children needed food. They needed food to live. And so, you know, you kind of see that in our life. And what a famine is, it's the extreme scarcity of food or shortage of food, right? So me as a geographer, that's what actually my degree is a geography. I thought that it was pretty interesting that this would be a good time to go ahead and look at this land of Bethlehem and Israel. So as a geographer, I was interested in this, so I looked at the landscapes that make up Israel. And I think that we have a picture of Bethlehem. We don't have a picture of all the landscapes. But Israel is comprised of multiple geographic regions. You've got your coastal plains to the west along the Mediterranean Sea. We kind of talked about that when we talked about the woman at the well. You've got the north, which is full of deserts and mountains, and that's Galilee. That's where Galilee is in the Bible. Then you have your valleys in the south, where Judea would have been. And then the east, we have the Jordan Valley and the Jordan River. And then the southeast, we actually have the Dead Sea. And so that's exactly where Bethlehem is, right there on the Dead Sea. So if we search for Bethlehem, we see that it was near Jerusalem, so it was sandwiched between mountains and deserts, making it a prime spot for droughts to occur. It was close to the Dead Sea, where it is hot desert climate and year-long sunny skies, right? So if you ever do a study of the Dead Sea, right, you see that it's full of salt and no one swims in it. Fish can't live in it. And so this place of Bethlehem, for some reason, was experiencing a drought. So they decided to go and to dwell in the country of Moab, he, his wife, and his 2 sons. Now, just on the other side of the Dead Sea, we see Moab, right? Moab isn't a part of Israel. I think it's actually a part of modern-day Jordan now. But basically, they decided they were going to go there because they had heard that there was food there in the land. Now, it doesn't really make sense to me why there would be no food, and why there would be a drought in Bethlehem and not in Moab. I know they're far apart, but they're both still in this desert climate. But for some reason, God had put food there, but God had taken away the food in Bethlehem. And this is all that the Bible really tells us. It only tells us that they went. It doesn't say why they went. All we do know is that he planned on returning after the famine had ended. You see, many scholars assume that it's because Elimelech didn't have enough faith in God that God would take care of them during this time of the famine. This assumption is based upon what we see that happens next in Elimelech's life. And all we know is that there was a definite departure from the promised land in which God had delivered them to, back to where he had taken them out of. These were clearly steps in the wrong direction, and the question is, why was God allowing Elimelech and his family to go to Moab? What was he going to do in Moab to Elimelech? You see, sometimes in life we are dealt a bad hand. And if we take a quick glance into Psalms chapter 77, we see that the psalmist, and for the first 15 verses of this entire scripture, he talks about how much he complains about his life. He's overwhelmed with all these bad things happening to him. He doesn't quite understand. And he wonders if God had forgotten to show him some grace. But then we see that this psalmist takes a turn in the next 5 verses. And I really like what he says, and I think it pertains to Ruth and Naomi and all them in their situation. He says, "This is my anguish, but I remember the years of the right hand of the Most High. I will remember the works of the Lord. Surely I will remember your wonders of old, and I will also meditate on all of your work. And I'll talk about your deeds. Your way, O God, is in this sanctuary," which the sanctuary is us, "who is so great as a God as our God. You are the God who does wonders. You have declared your strength among the people. You have with your arm redeemed your people, the sons of Jacob and Joseph." And then, of course, at the end it says Sheila and our men. I think that we must do the same thing in the times of hardship and despair, wondering who we should put our faith in, right? Who do you put your faith in? Do you put your faith in God, or do you put your faith in yourself? But despite whoever you put your faith in, we must remember that God and what He has done for us and what He has declared to us through the sacrifice of Jesus. He is the one who saved us from being eternally damned to hell through what His Son did on the cross. And so how can we remember God? I want to share a couple ways for that. Right? It's oftentimes in our life that we often forget what God actually does and what He did. The first thing that you can do is you can remember the works of God and His wonders that He has performed in the past. So what has God done for me in the past? The next thing that you can do is meditate on those works. You can sit there and for a moment just take a second and breathe and think, man, God, look at what you've done for me. And then you can talk about those wonderful works, right? You know, don't you want to be the one that says, this is what God did for me. This is what He's done for me in my life, and this is how I got here. The next thing is that we need to stand on who we know He is. He is in our sanctuary. He is with us. He abides with us. He loves us. He is great. He does wonders. He has done miraculous things, not only in the lives of those today, but also in the lives of those like Ruth and Naomi. Then we can declare that strength to other people. And then lastly, we can realize that no matter what's going on in our life, that God has in fact redeemed us. So as we take ourselves back into the world of Cinderella, the story begins with Cinderella living with her stepmother and her 2 daughters. We quickly come to find out that Cinderella has basically been treated horribly by them and to do all sorts of things that the stepmother wouldn't dare allow the other daughters to do. You see, Cinderella, just like Amalek, has been placed in a bad situation. Not of her own fault, but just as the result of her father, who had decided to marry once her mother had died at a young age. We also see someone else that's similar to Cinderella, or to Amalek in the story. Because now we find out that her dad was dead, right? That's one of the things in Cinderella, you're like, how did she get this spot? And you find out her dad's dead. And spoiler alert for what we're actually about to read further on in Ruth. But she was forced to live with an evil stepmother that for some reason or another had a vendetta against her. Through research, it can be found that basically this hate had come from the stepmother hearing a conversation that Cinderella had with her dad, where her dad told her that she reminded him of his late wife. And that's why he loved her so much. So just like with Amalek, Cinderella's dad ended up having to take a different route in life because the woman he had loved had died. So he married Lady Tremaine. And so what will happen next in the story of Cinderella, we'll find out. But that leads me to my point number 2, that disaster strikes. So it kind of gives you a little bit of, oh, this might be what happens. So let's continue where we left off in verse 1. The name of the man was Amalek, and the name of his wife was Naomi. And the names of their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, and they were Ephrathites. And so if you don't know what that means, and maybe I'm not even saying that word right, that means that they were kind of royalty. They were wealthy people in Bethlehem. And they went to the country of Moab, and they remained there. So why was going to Moab a no-no? First off, it was a treacherous journey. To go to Moab, one would have to hike through the desolate Jericho Pass, through the Judean wilderness near the Dead Sea, and then going across the Jordan River, enter into Moab. Secondly, as the land of Moab is concerned, there's two factors that add to the speculation of why Amalek was going out of the will of God by traveling there. First off, the Moabites descended through Lot and his daughters. Well, and it's in a weird way. He descended through Lot and his daughters through incest, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. Second, Moab was an enemy of Israel. Some scholars have an opposite view as they state that Israel at the time would have been worse off, right? So the question for some scholars is, why does God even have a problem with him going to Moab? Because Israel is a place that is horrible and is seeing all these bad things going on during this time of the Judges. But some of them would have been okay some of them say it would have been okay for them to live in Moab, because as long as they didn't show some degree of peace between the two nationalities, it would have been fine that they go there. But regardless, we see that Amalek didn't make it 10 years. It says he died and she was left with her 2 sons. It's hard to say that this was a direct hand of God's judgment against him. Sometimes it's difficult for us to discern why tragic things happen in our life. Sometimes the question is, why did this happen? And why, God? Why would you do this to me? But Amalek was trying to escape his family's problems. But sometimes, no matter what we do or where we go, the same problems in one place follow us to another. If something is a part of God's will, it will happen regardless of what you do. And the reality behind that is you can't run from God. But nevertheless, we see that Mahlon and Chilion took Moabite wives. So not only had they moved to Moab, but they've also decided to marry 2 Moabite women. It says, now they took wives of 2 of the women of Moab. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth, and they dwelt there about 10 years. This is another issue that is debated often among scholars, but for the most part, there's a common belief that Israelites should not marry Moabites because of their descendants. As it is stated, the Moabite descendants come from Lot through incest with his daughter. The story behind this Moabite people is one that is not easy to read in the Bible. It's in fact that the daughters of Moab had basically just went through this huge transition in their life where Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. Not only that, but they lost their mother. And then what happened in that weird sense of, there's things happen that's weird in the Bible, but they took the liberty amongst themselves to get their father drunk and to have sex with him in order to have sons, because they knew that if a woman didn't have sons, then there wasn't much to do with them. Right? They were kind of outcast. And so they took matters into their own hands instead of trusting God. You see, not only were the Moabites descendants from a horrible situation and enemies of the Israelites, but they were also pagans. They were pagans who worshipped the war god Shamash. And the god is described as the god of the Moabites in the Bible. In order to please Shamash, the Moabites would perform child sacrifice. As was the case for the king Mesha, as he sacrificed his son in 2 Kings to this god of Moab, because he couldn't conquer Israel. It's kind of ironic. So not only did they worship other gods beside the Christian gods, but they also sacrificed kids. And these were the type of people that Orpah and Ruth had grown up around. So then we see that Mahlon and Chilion died. So the women survived her 2 sons and her husband. So not only had their husband died, but they were all childless widows. So just like Lot's daughters, they knew that this would be an issue. To be a childless widow was to be among the lowest, most disadvantaged classes in the ancient world of Israel. There was no one who would support you, and basically you had to live off the generosity of others. Naomi had no family in Moab and no one else to help her. It was a very desperate situation. No matter how strong we are, when disaster strikes in life, we often find out how strong our faith really is. So the question for me to you today is, how strong is your faith? Oftentimes, our faith only stays intact when we are comfortable. But once we become uncomfortable, our faith comes into question. And again, we ask ourselves, why, God? Why have you done this to me? But as Christians, we should continue to have faith in God regardless of whether or not we are high up on this mountain or low in the valley. It's pretty interesting because even Olivia went to Hebrews this morning. I'm going to actually the next chapter. In Hebrews 11:1, we find that definition of faith. It says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. And also in Hebrews 11, we find out that faith in God is what carried those in the Bible, some of those who are most well known, such as Abel, Enoch, Noah, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Rahab, Gideon, Barak, Samson, and many others. And these were people who had more faith and conquered kingdoms. They administered justice. They gained what was promised. They shut the mouths of lions. They quenched the fury of flames and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned into strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead and raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released, so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers. Some faced floggings and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in the deserts, mountains, and caves, and holes in the ground. Everybody that I mentioned before, those were all types of things that they were experiencing in their own life. But it's through faith and action that they were able to overcome the world. And just like at the end of Hebrews 11, we read, God had planned something better than they could have ever imagined for themselves. And it was through God's plan that those who experienced these hard trials and discomfort were made perfect. So don't allow your faith to waver. Hold strong to the God who has brought you and others out through hard times. It is through the power of God that we will overcome. So back to Cinderella for a moment. Throughout the story, we see that the stepmother takes actions against her stepdaughter that were truly terrible. She gave her things that she couldn't do, or that she had to do in order so that she might not enjoy her life. And she allowed basically for the other daughters to abuse her and to bully her, and that caused her to lose all hope. So as the story continues, we learn that there's this village. And in this village, there's going to be a ball where Prince Charming will be selecting a woman to be his next wife. And of course, Cinderella doesn't have any type of dress or formal clothing to attend, so the group of trusty helpers throw together a dress for her to wear, of which Lady Tremaine allows her daughters to rip up and tear apart as they're about to leave for this ball. So in a situation of disaster for our main protagonist, Cinderella, she runs into the forest and she's followed by all those who love her in a big moment where something supernatural happens. She meets the fairy godmother, and I guess in our story, the fairy godmother is kind of like God, right? Who sings this iconic song, Bippity Boppity Boo, as she turns the mice into horses, the horse into a coachman, the dog into a footman, and a pumpkin into the coach, or into the thing. And in reality, at the end, she places Cinderella into one of the most beautiful dresses that even today women adore. And so then, with the help of her fairy godmother, she takes off towards the ball. So that leads me to my third point. Put faith into action. So in verse 6, we see that Naomi arose with her daughter-in-laws that she might return to the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by bringing them bread. What else could she do, right? She was in a country with no husband and no sons. If God was blessing Bethlehem with food again, it was time for her to leave, and that's exactly what she had chosen to do. So in verse 7, we see her take off with her two daughters-in-law with her, and they went on their way to return to the land of Judah. This kind of sets Naomi apart from other women. Most women would see what good God was doing in another place and choose not to travel there because it would be hard. And it would be hard, the journey would be hard. And so sometimes us in life, we aren't willing to take this step out of our comfort zone because it's hard. Well, Naomi says, I've got to do it. I've got to go, and I want to receive what God had done. Naomi could have simply stayed in Moab, wishing her life was better, but never doing anything about it. But instead, she chose to believe in the providence of God and return back to the land in which she loved, which was home. And in verse 8, Naomi says to her two daughters, "Go, return to each your mother's house. The Lord deal with you kindly as you have dealt with me and the dead." Naomi felt compassion for her daughters-in-law. She wanted what was best for them and felt that if God was going to bless them, it would be in their home, in Moab. The ancient Hebrew word for deal kindly is hesed. Hesed encompasses the deeds of mercy performed by a more powerful party for the benefit of the weaker one. You see, Naomi recognizes that if it was up to her own doing, that these two women would never experience a blessing from God. She can't offer what God has to offer. She knows that life will be rougher for them if they go, because the Israelites will look down upon Moabite women that choose to come to Bethlehem to live. And if for God's sake Naomi was to die in Bethlehem and these two women were there, what kind of life would they have? What kind of situation would they be put into unless they had married someone from Israel? And then after this, in a weird way, she thanked them for how kind they were to her husband and her sons. We see that Naomi say, "The Lord grant you may find rest, each in the house of her husband." She described marriage as a place of rest for Orpah and Ruth. She knows that through marriage, God would give them a hope and a future, refreshing their lives through a loving husband and hopefully children that God would bless them with. They would have the rest of instead of being scared and being unrested, they would have rest from wandering in fear and food insecurity. They would have a place to call home. So she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. This moment shows what type of mother-in-law Naomi had been to these women. She had loved them and made them feel welcome regardless of where they came from. She had taken them out of a pagan religion and brought them to a God that loves them no matter what they had done or where they had came from. And this was amazing due to where Naomi must have been mentally. Think about what she's been through. She just lost her husband. She just lost her sons. She's been in this area, this place called Moab, which is these enemies of Israel. And she's had to endure this herself now that she's without her husband and sons. But regardless of all that, Naomi still wishes the best for Orpah and Ruth. Verse 10 shows their response as they say to her, "Surely we will return with you to your people." But then Naomi shows how truly heartbroken she is, not only for herself, but for them as well. As she says, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb that may be your husbands?" They are from Moab. Naomi is heading back to Israel. Again, Naomi understands that the only chance these women have for rest from hunger, from danger, from loneliness and destitution is for them to remarry someone in their home country. She says, "Turn back, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. And if I should stay and have hope, if I should have a husband tonight, and who should also bear sons." The only way she thinks, right? This is all of her own thinking, is that they can only have rest if they stay in Naomi's life, is if they have sons, if she has sons for them to marry. Sadly, Naomi has passed this age of childbearing, so this isn't a possibility. And in this era, the likelihood that anyone would want to marry a woman too old for childbearing is slim. Naomi isn't even considering. She isn't considering at all what God could do with her at this point. To her, there is just no way that these women will ever find happiness in the land of Israel. She said, "Would you wait for them until they are grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Naomi believes that it was God who allowed her to lose her sons and husband. She probably even thinks that he may have been the cause for it. She goes as far as saying that he has gone out against her. Naomi probably doesn't understand why God would do this to her. Why would he leave her without a hope and a future? She wasn't being punished for her own sin, but the unwise decision that her husband had made to come to Moab and leave the promised land. So why in the world would God be doing this to me? So in order for her daughters-in-law to leave, she tries to throw out convincing arguments. First, she's too old. Second, who would marry her, and even if they could try? Finally, even if she got married that very night and gave birth to her son 9 months later, would Orpah and Ruth wait until the boys were old enough to marry? It's a much better if they separate now. But we see that what their answers are. It says in verse 14 that they lifted up their voices and wept again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law. Of course, Orpah was one that left, right? But Ruth clung to her. You see, sometimes in life, all we have is our faith to cling to. In 1 Timothy 1:19, it says, cling to your faith in Christ and keep your conscience clear. For some people have deliberately violated their consciousness. As a result, their faith has been shipwrecked. Our faith is what makes us stronger. If we choose to know God and to place our trust in Him, to have faith in Him, sometimes when life throws you the biggest of curveballs, all you have left is your faith in the Most High. So do not allow your faith to be shipwrecked because you have chosen to abstain from your faith in God, but rather cling. Hold on to God, and no matter what, do not let Him go. The thing that I like about 1 Timothy 19 is that it begins with faith and it ends with faith. And so it must be the same way in our own life. We should begin our walk with God in having faith, knowing that He is going to take care of us. That no matter what we go through in life, no matter what situation we're to bear, that He will always be there for us. And at the end of our life, as we're on our deathbed, or whatever is to come, we must be able to look at God and say, God, I have placed my faith in You. And God, I have faith that You are going to do exactly what You told me that You're going to do. That I'm going to get to go to heaven. And there's other things that we can place our faith in. He says, fear not, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous hand. He says, I will never leave you or forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. I have, this is the one verse that I absolutely love. I love that God put this in the Bible. He says, I have. He didn't say that I will. He says, I have overcome the world. And then lastly, the verse that we all hope for, the place that we all want to go, He says, I prepare a place for you. I will come back and take you to be with me, that you may be where I am also. That's where our faith should lie. Our faith should lie in a God that since the beginning of time has constructed this huge story and placed you in it because He knows that there has been made a way through Jesus Christ for you to return back to Him. And that's where our faith should go. That's where Naomi should have went with her faith. So while Naomi was no Lady Tremaine, we do see her try to persuade Orpah and Ruth to stay in Moab. So what happened to Cinderella? We see her faith in all that the fairy godmother had done, right? She took off towards the ball. So in the rest of Cinderella, here's what happened. She goes to the ball. She meets Prince Charming. If you don't remember the movie, it's actually a beautiful moment, right? You've got Prince Charming sitting up there, and he's like, man, who are all these women? And then out of nowhere, Cinderella is in the background, and Prince Charming's glaze just kind of she looks at her and he's like, holy smokes, she is so beautiful, I've got to go, right? So she goes to this ball where she meets Prince Charming, knowing that at midnight, when she comes there, that she needs to be out of the castle by that time. So she runs out of the castle and she drops her glass slipper. Well, who finds it? No one but the young prince. The rest of the story is that of a bit of a struggle to bring Cinderella back together with her true love. In hopes again, spoiler alert, Ruth eventually finds love. We'll get there. Just hold on. But in the end, despite a mean stepmother, 2 rotten stepsisters, and an evil cat, Cinderella ultimately gets to try on a slipper in front of the Grand Duke so that she might be the one who ends up with a happy ending as she marries Prince Charming and gets to live the rest of her life out of a much better place than that of which she started. Now, doesn't that sound like a good ending to a rocky start? And so later on, what we're going to see here in Ruth, and we can already have our musicians come up as I close this out. But what we're going to see later on in Ruth is that this whole thing that happened between Elimelech and moving to Moab, and this whole thing that happened with Naomi, and Naomi becoming bitter, as we'll see next week, that God is at work in this story. God is at work in these people's lives. And the interesting thing about Ruth is, I think, if not many times, God is not mentioned much in this story, right? But instead, God is still very much a part of what is going to happen for these two women as they move on through this story of Ruth. And so, therefore, there's three things that I would like to say, and I think that's our last slide today, is that God can, He will, and He does. God can save you from any situation you're going through. Not only can He, but He will take you out of that situation. Right? And sometimes the question is, well, how do we get out of that situation? That's where your faith comes most. You have to put your faith in action. If you're just sitting there waiting for God to do something, sometimes it's luckily some people that happens for them like that. But most of the time, what we must do as Christians is we must place our faith in God, we must put it into action, and then God will, in fact, deliver us out of whatever we're going through. So today, as we close out the service, and as you're thinking about Naomi and Ruth's situation, and you're like, what's going to happen next? I want you to also think about your own life. What situations do you have going on in your life right now that you're like, God, why have you done this to me? Why have you placed me in this situation that I just don't understand? I don't quite get why I'm here today. But God's saying that, man, just go ahead and put your faith into action. Go ahead and trust in me, and I will take you out of that. Because one day, regardless of how this earth is, you're going to be in a place called heaven, where there will be no issues. There will be no fighting. There will be no death. There will be no disease. There will be no hospitals, because God will take care of everything. And so today, if you're going through something in your life and you feel like you need to come up here and let go of it, I'm going to ask that you do that as we lead into this time of prayer, in this time of coming to God. Bring yourself up here and go ahead and tell God, God, I can't do this on my own. I just can't get through this. And God's going to, I guarantee you, just because of what He does for me, God's going to tell you, all right, let's do something about it. And God's going to intervene, and some crazy things are happening. God's going to pull a fairy godmother moment. He's going to put you in a dress if you're a woman, and He's going to take you to that ball, and you're going to get married, and it's going to be amazing. He's going to do that for your life as well. So if you will, let's go ahead and start singing. If I can, have two deacons come, or two elders come up here for me. And I'd love for you all to come up here today. Thank you.